Hey, hello Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to look at Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2, because there's two C's. And EC2 is one of the oldest services in AWS. And for that reason, it features very heavily in the Certified Cloud Practitioner, in all the associates, all the professionals, and all the specialties. So understanding EC2 is essential for your certification journey to the cloud. So what is EC2? Well, basically, it's just a virtual server or servers in the cloud, and it reduces the time required to obtain and boot new server instances to minutes, allowing you to quickly scale capacity both up and down and as your computing requirements change. So this is a server room or a data hall, and inside a data center there may be literally hundreds of data halls just filled with endless racks of servers. And what used to happen before AWS and before public cloud providers is if you as a customer wanted let's say 2 web servers and 2 database servers, you would contact a managed service provider, someone like Rackspace, for example, and you place an order with them. They would then go out and actually physically acquire the servers, and then they would rack and stack them. They'd plug them in, they'd cable them, give them power, then they'd have to bring them online, then they'd have to bring it up to your specifications to install all the software, that sort of thing. And you'd have to sign a contract for usually 3 years, sometimes up to 5 years, and you would basically be renting that server off them. And of course, the deployment times would be anywhere from 2 weeks, and even with some service providers that I work for, if we were doing really complex 100+ server deals, deployment times could be at least 6 months. So it'd take an awful long time. And then Amazon EC2 came along and just changed everything. Suddenly you could go into the web console and you could just say, hey, I want a virtual machine, and it would be ready for you within within seconds, definitely within minutes, and you would just be instantly available. And you no longer had these massive wait times, and it just changed the whole industry overnight. It literally revolutionized tech. So with EC2, there's different pricing models, and the first one is on demand, and this allows you to pay a fixed rate by the hour or even by the second with no commitment. And this is what we're going to be using for the rest of this course. We're going to provision little EC2 instances. They're going to be little Linux servers, and effectively we're going to be paying for them by the second. We then have reserved. This gives you a capacity reservation, and you get huge discounts on an hourly charge. This is where you are locked into a contract. So the contract terms are 1-year or 3-year terms, and depending on how much you pay up front, that maximizes your discount. So the more you pay up front and the longer contract term, the better discount you get. So the best, most cost-effective way to get an EC2 instance is to sign a 3-year contract and pay that 3 years all up front, and you'll get the maximum discount. We then have spot. This kind of works like the stock market. This enables you to bid a price that you want to pay, and the price moves around all the time. And when it hits your bid price, then it provisions the instance. And when the spot price drops below your bid price, it means that you're going to lose that server. So it moves around all the time, and it's used for applications where you don't have to worry about losing your servers, basically. We then have dedicated hosts. These are actually physical EC2 servers that are dedicated for your use. So very similar to the picture I just showed you in the previous slide. This basically helps you reduce your cost by allowing you to use your existing server-bound software licenses. Fewer and fewer people do this, but sometimes when you use a particular technology, you have to have it on dedicated hosts as per the license terms and conditions. So let's have a look at the different use cases for these 4 different pricing models. So we've got on-demand pricing, and that's useful for users that want the low cost and flexibility of EC2 without any upfront payment or long-term commitments. So students like us, for example. And it's good for applications with short-term, spiky or unpredictable workloads that cannot be interrupted. And it's also good for applications that are being developed or tested on EC2 for the first time. So on-demand is basically all we're going to use in this course. Reserve pricing is very useful for applications with steady state or predictable usage, so applications that require reserved capacity, and users are able to make upfront payments to reduce their total computing costs even further. So like I said earlier, the more you pay upfront and the longer the contract, the more discount you get. Reserved has a few different pricing types. So we've got standard reserved instances. These offer up to 75% off on demand. So the more you pay upfront and the longer the contract, the greater discount that you get. So as we go through the rest of this course, you're going to learn that EC2 has a whole bunch of different types of instances. One could be used for high performance memory. One could be used for high performance compute. And the problem with standard reserved instances is you can't change between the instance families. So you can't go from a high performance memory over to high performance compute. And that's why they invented convertible reserved instances. So these offer up to 54% off the on-demand capability, and you are able to change the attributes of the reserved instances. So you can go from one instance family class to another, and so long as you basically, the exchange results in the creation of reserved instances of equal or greater value. And don't worry, it's completely beyond the scope of this course and even any of the associates to understand that. It's really when you're going into the professional level certs, you need to be able to work that. But right now, all you should be aware of is that there are different types of EC2 instances, which we're about to cover off. And with standard reserved instances, you can't convert from one to the other. With convertible reserved instances, you can. We then have scheduled reserved instances, and these are available to launch within the time windows that you reserve. So maybe you have a whole bunch of people coming in at 9 a.m. every morning, and everyone's firing up their, some kind of application, and it has a heavy toll on your application. But maybe they only use the application for the first hour in the morning, then they all go and have their meetings. So you can actually schedule a reserved instance from that 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Time window. So that's all scheduled reserved instances are. Moving on to spot pricing. So what would spot pricing be useful for? Well, this is useful for applications that have flexible start and end times, and applications that are only feasible at very low compute prices. And there's a whole bunch of case studies on the AWS website about sort of genomics companies and engineering companies who do a lot of computing, and they do it in the middle of the night to keep their costs low. And this last point, straight from the documentation itself, it says it's useful for users with urgent computing needs for large amounts of additional capacity. Now, of course, that's only true if the spot price is going to be below what it costs for an on-demand instance. If you have an urgent computing need and the spot price is above the price of an on-demand instance, then you probably just want to go ahead and use an on-demand instance. We then have dedicated hosts, and pricing is useful for regulatory requirements that may not support multi-tenant virtualization. So it might be that you're in a particular government department and there's some kind of law that says it must be on dedicated hosts. That does happen. So you would need to use dedicated hosts from AWS in order to use public cloud. It's also great for licensing, which does not support multi-tenant virtualization. So this could be some Microsoft licensing, Oracle licensing, VMware licensing, etc. So this is where you would use a dedicated host, and dedicated hosts can be purchased on demand, and you pay by an hourly basis, and they can also be purchased as a reservation for up to 70% off of the on-demand price. So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about convertible instances versus just normal reserved instances, there's a whole bunch of different EC2 instance types. Before you freak out, you do not need to know any of these instance types going into the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam or Solutions Architect Associate exam. Where you start to get tested on instance types is really around SysOps Administrator Associate as well as the professional level exams. And so these are the different instance types, and I'll just run through them and what their use cases are. So we've got F1, which is a field programmable gate array, and this is, if that sounds complicated, it is really complicated. The chips actually basically program themselves. It's quite cool stuff. And the use case for this is for things like genomics research, financial analytics, real-time video processing, big data, etc. Then have i3. These are our high-speed storage. So this is useful for things like NoSQL databases as well as data warehousing. Got our G3s. So these are graphics intensive. And again, these are useful for things like video encoding and 3D application streaming. Got H1, which is high disk throughput. This is useful for MapReduce workloads and distributed file systems such as HDFS and MapRFS. And don't worry if you don't understand what any of this is. Like I said, you don't need to know this to pass your Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. T3s essentially will be using the T class throughout the rest of this course. This is your low-cost general purpose. So these are useful for things like web servers, small database servers, etc. Ds are for dense storage, so this will be for like file servers, data warehousing, etc. R, I remember R in terms of RAM, so it's memory optimized, so memory intensive applications and databases. Your M5s are your general purpose, so these can be used for application servers. Your C5s are your compute optimized, so these can be used for CPU intensive apps. Your P3s are graphics, so general purpose GPUs, and these can be used for machine learning, Bitcoin mining, etc. Your X1s are really heavily memory optimized, so these are things like SAP HANA. These have like huge amounts of memory in them. And then the newest one is a Z1D, which is high compute capacity and high memory footprint. And this is ideal for things like electronic design automation and certain relational database workloads. Now, I know what you're thinking, how am I going to remember this? And the numbers are not even that important. They're going to change throughout all of 2019. There'll be probably an R6 or an M5 or an M6 or whatever. But don't worry, you don't need to remember this at all going into the Cloud Practitioner exam. That being said, it is useful to know in real life, and it is useful to know if you do go on to do SysOps Administrator Associate or any of the pros. So this is the way I remember it. So F for FPGA, I for IOPS, G for graphics, and it basically spells Fight Dr. McPixie. So fight Dr. McPixie. And over here we have a lovely graphic of Dr. McPixie. You can see her stethoscope, or you can see that she's a doctor by the light on her head, and she's wearing the doctor's sort of outfit, and she's a pixie. She's a Scottish pixie, so it's McPixie. And that's how I remember it. It's a stupid mnemonic, but it works. And when you are doing the some of the associate and some of the professional levels, they'll throw in some imaginary EC2 instances into the questions. And you know that those are wrong because that doesn't fit the Fight Dr. McPixie mnemonic. So long as you remember Fight Dr. McPixie mnemonic, then you'll be able to remember all the different EC2 instance classes as you go through and do your exams. Don't worry, if you just want to do Cloud Practitioner though, you don't need to remember any of the EC2 instance classes going into your exam. So we need to move on now to Amazon EBS. So we've been talking about EC2. What's EBS? Well, EBS is just the virtual hard disks that EC2 uses. So every server has a disk, and every virtual server has a virtual disk. So Amazon EBS allows you to create storage volumes and attach them to EC2 instances. Once attached, you can create a file system on top of these volumes. You can run a database, or you can install an operating system, or you can use them in any other way that you would use a block device. And by block device, we just mean a virtual hard disk or a physical hard disk. So Amazon EBS volumes are placed in specific availability zones where they are automatically replicated to protect you from the failure of a single component. So EBS volumes will always be in a particular availability zone. Your EC2 instance will always need to be in the same availability zone as your EBS volume. So just think of EBS as a virtual disk in the cloud. So just remember that image there, a virtual disk in the cloud. That's all EBS is. EBS comes in two different types. So we've got SSD and we've got magnetic. SSD, we've got two different types of SSD. So we've got our general purpose SSD. This is sometimes referred to as GP2. And this is what we basically are going to use for the rest of the course. We then have provisioned IOPS SSD, and this is sometimes referred to as IO1. And these are the highest performance SSD volumes where you need really, really high performance in terms of IOPS. So IOPS just stands for input output per second. provisioned. So basically, if you've got a really high-performing database, you probably want provisioned IOPS rather than GP2, rather than general-purpose SSD. We then have magnetic. This comes in 3 different flavors. We've got throughput-optimized hard disk drive, and this is referred to as ST1. So this is a low-cost hard disk drive that's designed for frequently accessed and throughput-intensive workloads. Then have a cold hard disk drive. This is SC1. This is basically used for things like file servers, so for things that are less frequently accessed workloads and where you want to save some money. And then you've got magnetic, which is a previous generation, and you don't really need to know that going into the Certified Cloud Practitioner. You just need to remember really the 4 of them. So GP2, IO1, ST1, and SC1. So GP2 is general purpose, provisioned IOPS is IO1, ST1 is throughput optimized, and SC1 is your low cost storage, so your cold hard disk drive. So that is EBS. They're just virtual disks in the cloud. So what are my exam tips? So Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud is a web service that provides resizable compute capacity in the cloud. It's basically a virtual server in the cloud. That's all EC2 is. EC2 comes in 4 different pricing models. So we've got on demand, we've got reserved, we've got spot, and we've got dedicated host. On demand, you pay for by the hour or by the second. Reserve, you pay up front and for a defined contract term. It could be 1 year or 3 year. The more you pay up front, the more discount you get. Spot, the price moves around all the time like the stock market. And then we have dedicated hosts, and you'd only use this where you've got regulatory requirements or licensing requirements. One popular exam topic is what happens if a spot instance is terminated by EC2. So let's say that the price has gone down, has gone above what you're prepared to pay for it. Then essentially you're not going to be charged for a partial hour of usage if the price goes above what you're prepared to pay for it. However, if you terminate the instance yourself, you are going to be charged for that hour in which the instance ran. So it's all around who terminates the instance. Is it because the price has gone above what you're prepared to pay? Well, then you're not going to be charged for that partial hour. If you then terminate the instance, however, and you do it like 58 minutes in, you're going to be charged for that full hour. So bear that in mind as well. And then try and remember the mnemonic. Can you remember it? Fight Dr. McPixie. So FIGTDRMCPX and then Z. And don't worry, you don't need to understand the instance types going into the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. Where it becomes really useful is when you do things like SysOps Administrator or any of the professional level certs. Knowing this can honestly pick you up like 5 or 6 different questions. So just see if you can remember Fight Dr. McPixie. And then finally, just remember the different EBS volume types. So EBS is just the virtual disk in the cloud that the virtual servers run off. And there's 4 different types. Well, there's 5, but there's 4 different ones that are really relevant. So that you've got your 2 SSDs. So you've got general purpose SSD, which we'll be using for throughout the rest of this course. You've got your provisioned IOPS SSDs. This would be useful for things like really high performance database servers, etc. You then have magnetic storage, and we've got 2 different types in here. We've got our throughput optimized, so ST1. So this could be things for basically data warehouses, for example. And then we've got our cold hard disk drive, and that's called SC1. And this could be used for file servers, things where you need to store files cheaply, but you're not going to be accessing them all the time. And then we have magnetic, which is previous generation. So I appreciate this has been a little bit of information overload. As always in this course, the best way to learn AWS is to start getting our hands dirty with it, start playing with it. So in the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and get rid of all the theory, and we're going to start provisioning some EC2 instances. And this is where it starts to become really, really fun. You're going to learn how to build little web servers in the cloud, and then you're going to go in and delete them afterwards. It's lots of fun. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.